everybody, welcome to Master the NEC, where we talk about the National Electrical Code. My name is Paul, and on today's episode we're going to talk about a specific area of the National Electrical Code that tends to bring a lot of confusion. And obviously it's going to be in Article 250, which is grounding and bonding, so that is what people tend to see that and they go, oh, okay, it's got to be confusing. But we're going to talk about one specific section that recently was a debate in one of the online forums, and I figured we would do a lesson on it to kind of explain a little bit and help explain its progression from the 2011 to the 2014 code. Disclaimer here, as an electrician for years, when I installed product out in the field, sometimes I would have to follow literally the code and what it actually says, and if I did that, I knew that in doing that, I was going to be fairly accurate when it comes to the installation for the inspection authority. So through the years, as I learned, I became an inspector, and at the end of that, a supervisor, and then became an engineer too, and went on from there. I started really dealing deeper into the code, so the practices that I might have done back when I was a master electrician or a journeyman was acceptable to the code, but might have been a little more than is necessary, but I did it anyway. Right? So we're going to talk about today a couple methods of how to achieve something. And what are we talking about? We're talking about when we're having a ferrous raceway that's from an enclosure to the grounding electrode, and how you bond that ferrous raceway, that iron or steel raceway, and be in compliance with 250.64e. Now, a lot of people think that you have to physically connect the grounding electroconductor to both ends of the raceway. Now, that would be true if we had a raceway that was sitting unconnected to an enclosure, and you need to bond both ends of it to create a parallel path through it so that the reactance that takes place doesn't mitigate the effectiveness of that grounding electroconductor. But what about when one end was connected to an enclosure and the other end stops at a grounding electrode? In this case, we'll just use a ground rod to make it simple. So in this case, what do you do, and what are the methods you can do? Well, the easiest part that we can tackle is the part at the electrode. The code's pretty clear that that connection at the end, each end of the raceway, has to be made continuously connected to the grounding electroconductor or the electrode. So, or the fitting itself at the end, or the clamp. So that gets done at the end near the actual electrode. Fairly simple. We're pretty basic on that. We understand that we have to make that connection so it acts as one. Okay, parallel connection, bringing them together, treating it as one. But what about at the enclosure? That's where a lot of people will get a little confused, and I don't think they get confused enough where they make an incorrect installation. I just think they forget that we have some general bonding requirements that are required for that raceway to that enclosure in accordance with 250.92b. And subsequently there's option B2 through B4 that they have to be aware of, and that is the assurance of that connection in order to create that bond that is a little higher level bond, because it is service equipment we're talking about today. But I'm going to show you that back in the day when I did work, in order to avoid confusion, when we would come out of an enclosure, well, let's say it was a rigid metal conduit that's protecting the grounding electroconductor, and it actually connected to an enclosure. What we would do, because more often than not we would run into situations where we had concentric or eccentric knockouts and they all weren't coming out, or there was some kind of impaired issue here. So what we would do is we put a bonding bushing on the end with a lay-in lug attached, and we would take our 6 gauge, which is all that's required to be run to a grounding electroconductor of the ground rod type. What we would do is we would run it to there, come through, take it and loop it through that lay-in lug so it physically is connected to that end of the raceway. And then we would take it up to the grounded terminal bus inside of the service panel. And that's how we would do it. There was no argument on whether or not each end was bonded. We'd do what we needed to do down at the electrode, make sure we bond that into the raceway. And then when we go up to the other end, we would physically do that. All it cost us was a bonding bushing and a clamp. If I'm going to spend more time arguing with somebody that might not understand the code, then you'll agree that I can spend $4, $5, $6 on the clamp, be done, point to the way it reads, and walk away. But there are some people that want to save that $5 on that bonding bushing. Perfectly fine. No question about what you do. So how did they do it? Well, in the 2011 code, it kind of made the language there, it said it pretty clear that you use 250.92 for that assurance of that raceway to that enclosure. But prior to that, it's kind of muddy a little bit. It was a lot of confusion. The way they read the code, it says that, and it still says that in 14, is that they believe that grounding electrode conductor has to make direct connection, kind of like the bonding bushing method that I talked about previously. That was the only way to do it. However, when you look at a lot of the documents from people that I highly respect, whether it's Fred Hartwell or Phil Simmons or the Soares documents, things like that, you'll notice that in their depiction of it, it doesn't. It simply runs into the enclosure, over to the grounded terminal bus, which essentially is main bonding jumper connected to the actual enclosure. That's where you bring your grounded neutral conductors and you bring your equipment grounding conductors to that common location. It's connected directly to the panel, and then you have all that other bonding that takes place. We also remember that a lot of times when we're dealing with service bonding, we have to, when we come into those impaired knockouts, concentric, eccentric, we have to do something a little extra in order to be able to bond at least one end of that raceway. Don't have to do both ends when we're dealing with the service. Different subject, different topic, but we need to make that bond. So we typically will have a bonding jumper is one of the options to do it. All right, so what happens if you remove all of the concentrics, eccentrics, or whatnot? Then you don't need a bonding jumper. Then I can use a bonding bushing or a bonding lock nut and achieve it as well. Total knockout. In no cases can you ever use a standard lock nut for this application. So 250.92b gives us the guidance for making that connection. Treat it the same as you would when you're making that connection for the raceways to the service on the supply side, that extra assured type of bonding. Same thing takes place here. The key word is bond. All right? So what we're going to do is we're going to look at the National Electrical Code and try to clear up this. Again, at this point, if you're thinking, Paul, I already know all this. Why are you watching the video? Turn it off. Maybe it's not for you. Or maybe it is for you and you need to watch it. So let's see. So let's go on and look at the National Electrical Code and see what it says. All right, so here's the National Electrical Code. And you'll look over here, and I'll try to highlight it so we can follow along. In fact, let's do this. I'll highlight it as I talk about it, and you can follow along. So, Raceways enclosures for grounding electrode conductors. You'll see here that they added in the 2014 edition the Raceways and enclosures. Now, they added that throughout. They added Raceways, because that's basically what it is, right? We're talking Raceways, but you could have the grounding electrode conductor in an enclosure as well. Same concept applies. All right. So it says ferrous metal raceways and enclosures for grounding electrode conductors shall be electrically continuous from the point of attachment to the cabinets or equipment. And again, equipment could be a transformer, might be equipment that we're talking about, but in this case we're talking about a panel board inside of a cabinet application. And it says it has to be connected to the grounding electrode and shall be securely fastened to the ground clamp or fitting. So it has to be continuous from so we're looking at from continuous from the enclosure or cabinet all the way to the electrode. Okay. Now, what you also have to remember, again, is we have any independent pieces that might not be continuous that you're going to bond each in to make it continuous. Okay, that's what the 2011 talked about. You have to make it continuous, and so you make that bond. But what I believe the code is actually saying is the end that is bonded already in compliance with 250.64E2, which we'll talk about in a second, which is a method of bonding, that takes place, the one end of it is done. You still have to do what you got to do down at the electrode, where you have to take the raceway and you have to connect it either to the clamp or to the fitting, which is in connection with the grounding electrode conductor or the electrode. You make those connections there. That's one end, is it create a parallel condition where it's done. You don't have to worry about the reactance that takes place when that is not done, and it lessens the effectiveness of the grounding electrode conductor. That's done. You get to the equipment, here's where the confusion gets. Again, old school, I put a regardless, I would put a bonding bushing with a lay-in lug, and I would bring my 6 gauge down through the lay-in lug and then up to the terminal. That's just how I did it, and I never got anybody arguing about it. Okay? Again, half the battle is the argument. Sometimes you just won't win. Okay? So you have to, that is literally doing what the code says. Literally. Okay. But if the code meant that was the only way to do it, or the way to interpret it, then it wouldn't go on to give you 250.64E2. And let's look at E2. So in E2, it reminds you, it says, okay, what are the methods to achieve this? Well, it says bonding, which is what we're talking about up here. Bonding shall be in compliance with 250.92b, and it has to be ensured by one of the methods in 250.92b2 through b4. Okay? Now, where a bonding jumper is used, okay, where that method is used based on what's listed in 250.92b, and again, think of it what you would do on a service application here where you're bonding a raceway for the service conductors. Here you'll see that again it says the bonding jumper for the grounding electrode conductor raceway or cable armor shall be the same size or larger than, so it can be larger, than the enclosed grounding electrode conductor. So it doesn't have to be larger than. So in our case we did a 6 gauge copper to a grounding electrode conductor with a ground rod. That bonding jumper would not have to be larger, thus is why we would loop through with the 6. That's just one way to do it. By no means is that saying that's the only way to do it, because I'm going to show you that it's not. Okay, so with that said, I'll give you this. Let's come back here to me. With that said, I have looked into this, and I rely on a lot of people of influence for me through the years when I've learned the code. And so I use a source book. I believe that that is a very valid document. I believe that IAI does a thorough job now that they have control of that document. I think it has been for years, but that's a great document. I also utilize something called what I call the second best known handbook for the National Electrical Code, and that is the one that's put out by Fred Hartwell. And that document is a pretty good document that I encourage people to have. So you have the traditional handbook by the National Electrical Code, or the NFPA, I guess I should say. And then you have the secondary version that's put out by Fred Hartwell and the McFarland's and all of those gentlemen. I never met those gentlemen, but I have met Fred. And you look at that document, and that gives a lot of explanation too. The good news is all of the documents that I use are opinions of other people. They just so happen to also be my opinion. Even though I did it with a bonding jumper in the past, it usually is because I had something that caused me to do it. It was an impaired knockout, or an oversized, or concentric or eccentric knockouts that pushed me to use a bonding jumper, which I achieved by using the 6 instead of having to run a separate one. It meant I didn't have to have any bonding jumper. I didn't have to go from that over to the grounding electrode conductor. I could just use the same one to do it. It just made it easy for me to do it that way. By no means is that the only way to do it. You could actually run a jumper over to it, split bolt onto it, and be done with it that way as well. Okay, not a problem. That was just the way I did it. But here's the thing. I want you to see what the actual handbooks say, and I don't have a source to be able to view. Incidentally, all these documents I did pay for. They're for educational purposes. I'm not charging for this information. It is not copyright infringement. It is for educational purposes only, and I paid for these documents, and you did not pay to watch this video. Okay? There's always one person out there, always one. They lurk around, and they want to cause trouble. All right, so let's look at the National Electrical Code, and let's look at the example that's given in the handbook. All right, so here's the example that's given in the handbook, and this is the handbook that's the Fred Hartwell handbook, and it's on page 465, and it is the 2011 edition. Excuse me, this is 2014. No, this is the 11 edition. And again, it did not change in the 2014. I don't have their version of the 14 yet, but this didn't change. It's the same intent here. So here's your cabinet. right? Service equipment, or in the case it could be a, here we go. We got the service equipment or enclosure. That's what it could be. And then over here you've got your raceway, right here. Okay, that's our ferrous metal raceway. And then you'll notice that this end here is meeting the application of the code, where this end of the raceway is actually bonded to the fitting. There is no fitting here. There is a fitting on the end. It's providing for a jumper to connect over to the actual electrode. Okay, or you could be in the fitting that makes connection to the grounding electrode conductor. Okay, here. But anyway, that's meeting the part for this part of the connection. Now, what about this part of the connection? The part of the connection over here that says bonded raceway connections, where it shows, and we're looking at the actual equipment here to the left in case my highlight boxes aren't showing up on the screen, which is entirely possible. It shows, and it'll be depicted by an arrow here in the middle that says bonded raceway connection. So you see that it is actually bonded to the enclosure, and yet the grounding electric conductor continues on up to the actual neutral bus. Now that neutral bus has a main bonding jumper that connects that bus to the enclosure. So by virtue of this connection, literally we are connecting to the enclosure and the raceway as the code is requiring. Now, like I said, you could have put an actual bonding bushing on this end with a lug on it. You could have taken this grounding electrode conductor and looped it through it if you want to be in the literal sense, and some jurisdictions might want that literal sense. Or the fact that all of these are connected together to the enclosure, and the fact that you chose a bonding method that was listed in 250.92b 2 through 4 to make this connection here, then that is cemented and that end is done. So this is all common. All of this equipment right here is common, okay, together, tied together. So by virtue of that, the end of the raceway is connected to the enclosure, which is connected via the main bonding jumper to the neutral bus, all connected together. So whether I had that equipment, grounding electrode conductor connected to a bonding bushing on the end, or I had it connected to the enclosure, depending on the type of knockout, whether we're dealing with concentric, eccentric, impaired or whatnot, which might mandate the same things that you would have to do for service bonding, for that assured connection to the with the service conductors are in, whether or not you're dealing with impaired and whatever. You have to use something other. Now, if it's a perfect cutout, perfect knockout, okay, you've knocked out all the concentric, eccentrics, you do it that way, you use a bonding lock nut. If you have something that impairs it, damage, reducers, then you might go with the method that I use, which is a bonding bushing with a lug, and you put a jumper over to it, okay? That's really your choice on how you do it, depending on the condition that you face. So if it's a perfect application where I come in and I may be protecting that conductor in a half trade size raceway, and I knock out a perfect half size knockout, and I come in, okay, I'm going to use a bonding lock nut, put that on there, drive that screw in, I'm really done, right? Okay, that's the concept. Now, if I have some kind of impaired knockout entry, then I have to do something that is a little extra, because that's what it says in 250.92b. That's what it says. So here's how I make this one simple. Follow the same rules that you're going to apply to when you have to bond the raceways when they come into the equipment on for the service conductor application, because that's where we're being drawn to in here, and that's what we're trying to make clear. Now, I think that the 2014 makes that a lot clearer. I do. It did essentially say the same thing in the 2011. It's just been broken out so that it's easier to understand. It added that term bonding in the charge statement, or the general statement, and then goes on to separate it out and tell you how to comply with bonding. And I think that's what the intent is. Will there be people out there who say, yep, you got to do it like I was saying earlier, you have to physically connect the end of that raceway to that grounding electric conductor? Okay. At the enclosure end, at the cabinet, whatever. Do it. It's fine. It'll be compliant. You won't have any argue with anybody. Everything will be fine. Okay? But I do believe that if you do all of the bonding right and you follow all the rules in 250.92b, whether or not you're dealing with concentrics, eccentrics, impaired, whether you need the bonding jumper or not, those applications, whether or not you can get away with all knockouts using a lock nut, a bonding lock nut, or you need a bonding bushing with the jumper, based on the condition of your nature of what's going on there with the impairedness or whatever of the knockouts, just like you would do at a service, you do the same thing. And I think that it's all considered connected together. It's acceptable. So hopefully that cleared it up a little bit. If I didn't clear it up for you, sorry. I made an attempt to try to clear it up for you, and hopefully you were able to get a little better understanding of it. If you have any questions, like always, visit our website. It's masterthenec.com. Go on. You'll see there's a link to our message board. Start a topic. Let's discuss it. Let's look at different views. I am by no means telling you that there is one perfect 100% way to do it, but you do have some guidelines that are given you in 250.92b when it comes to whether or not you're dealing with the impaired knockouts, damaged knockouts, concentric, eccentric. The rings are still there. Totally different if you punch it. You still have the assured. You never can use a standard lock nut for that assuredness. Okay, so one case you might have to have the bonding jumper. The other case you might be able to get away with the bonding bushing with the jumper. You might be able to get away with a bonding lock nut if it's 100% all the knockouts are out or it's a punched hole. Might be able to do either one of those. So if you have any additional questions, visit our website, masterthenec.com. Follow us on Twitter at masterthenec. Visit us on Facebook. Just go to Facebook and search for Master the NEC, or you can go to masterthenec.com. At the bottom, you'll see the links for the Twitter and Facebook. Click there, join, subscribe, agree to disagree, or learn something. Hey, it's your choice. It's your world. I'm just teaching in it. Thanks for watching. God bless. Until next time, thanks for watching Master the NEC.